Cannon, and I work with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and we're funded by the Office on Violence Against Women and the Office for Victims of Crime to do to help everyone with anything related to language access. So if it's language access, you ask me, and that's what I'm here for, right? If you don't ask me, then I sit in my chair and I play with my hair. And I do enjoy that, but I should be working. And once again, thank you, Susan, so much for inviting me to speak with all of you today. We're going over a lot of information. I do like to have it kind of an open format. So if you have any questions, just ask your questions. If you have any particular insights, or you want to talk about what's happening in your service area, because something I've raised kind of triggers a thought or an issue that you're seeing, just jump in. We want to keep this kind of a free-flowing conversation. Once again, it is a lot of information. The expectation isn't that you have and know everything once we're done. It's just to kind of get the wheels rolling for us, because now you're my people, right? We're here together having this conversation. And so when things come up, you just reach out to me. And if I don't know how to help you, I will find somebody that can help you. So let's see. Let me get the PowerPoint started. Apologies. It's been 3 years in and I still can't naturally just do all the PowerPoint stuff easily. That didn't, well, okay, what are you seeing my whole slideshow, or is it just, what
I
do you
see
see?
your screen, so
Yeah,
you probably want to go from
okay.
the beginning, start the slideshow.
Yeah, let's see. I had it working before. There we go.
And we will be sending the slides to you via email after the training, along with our evaluation form.
There we go. Okay, how about now? Are you seeing just the one slide now?
Yes,
Oh, okay,
perfect.
awesome. Awesome, awesome. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about is trauma-informed language access services and Title VI and how to better comply, or what the requirements are. So today, there we go. So hopefully what you get out of today is the ability to articulate what the language access requirements of Title VI are. And just in terms of when we're talking about Title VI, to think about it not just in terms of what your organization's obligations are under Title VI, but also what the other systems that your clients are engaging in, what their requirements are. To also walk away with 2 to 3 considerations when working with survivors with limited English proficiency to ensure trauma-informed practices, and to identify resources to help improve language access plans. So I like to start our conversation around language access with Ellen Pence's Complexity of Battered Women's Lives. And I want to frame this around the LEP individual. And so I'm going to take this back to probably a little over 20 years ago when I was in legal aid and legal services. And so I used to do the 5250 Reese petition hearings on the locked psychiatric unit. So in California, a medical professional can place somebody on an involuntary psychiatric hold and then place them and request permission to forcibly medicate them with psychiatric medications. So that's the Reese petition. And so I used to be attorney representing the individuals on the psychiatric unit who the hospitals wanted to keep in the hospital. And so this was a very typical case for me. And what happened was I arrived at the hospital and I looked at the record. And what happened was 911 was called. The husband called 911 reporting that his wife was not taking her medications and that he was concerned for her safety and the safety of their children. Officers arrived at the scene, interviewed the husband and the parents, and then based on that, placed her on an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric hold as a danger to herself and a danger to others, specifically her children. The admitting psychiatrist in his notes quoted the police report and diagnosed her as paranoid, schizophrenic, catatonic, non-responsive, danger to self, danger to others, specifically her children. The treating psychiatrist that requests the 14-day psychiatric hold and the Reese petition, so the petition to forcibly medicate her, quoted the police report. The admitting psychiatrist report diagnosed her as paranoid, schizophrenic, catatonic, non-responsive, refusing medication, danger to herself and a danger to her others, specifically her children. She's catatonic. Is she going to talk to me? No, right? And, but her name was Korean. And so as we work together, you'll learn my Korean is terrible, but I know how to say hi, right? So I said, oh, I'll just give it a shot, right? So I walked in and I said, hi, I'm your lawyer. You can talk to a judge if you want to leave the hospital. And she looked at me and she said, yeah, I don't want to be in the hospital. I want to go home. Obviously not catatonic. She just didn't speak English, right? And so then, because we obviously couldn't have the hearing, and eventually, because the hospital wasn't able to provide an interpreter for her, right? And this is California and this is Korean, which shouldn't be that hard, right? I found a social worker that was willing to come with me to the hospital, and the social worker was fluent in Korean. She spoke to the woman for less than 5 minutes, looked at me and said, I'll be right back. She walked to the nurse's station, walked back, and said, will you take this? And the woman said, yes, I'll take that. That's my medication. Right. So the whole time she was refusing the medication. First, she's on a locked psychiatric unit, scary place. Right. She was in a locked psychiatric unit with rapists, with killers, with people in acute psychiatric crisis, right? Very acute psychiatric crisis. And she couldn't speak English. And people were trying to talk to her in English. And not only that, they were telling her to take medication that she didn't know what it was, right? So, she eventually got out. But what I found out later, and this is when I was a new attorney, and I wasn't trained on identifying domestic violence, right? And I was just focusing on the legal issue for the psychiatric hold and the medication. What we found out later was that her husband and her in-laws, remember the 3 people that were interviewed, withheld her medication to send her into crisis so that they could call the police and have her arrested. Right? So is she going to get custody of her kids if she decides to divorce her husband? She's not, right? The police report says she's a danger to herself and a danger to her kids. 2 psychiatrists have evaluated her and said that she's a paranoid schizophrenic and that she's a danger to herself and a danger to her children. Will she leave if she can't get custody of her kids? We know just from working with clients that they frequently won't leave if they can't take their kids with them, right? Consider all the points of contact that this particular LEP woman engaged in, and the failure and the impact of not having language access had on her, right? We have this whole record, law enforcement, medical, that people are going to be relying on. But was it accurate? Was there any truth to what was being reported, what was being said about this particular woman, what this woman was diagnosed with, right? And it wasn't. And so when we consider individuals who are limited English proficient, and consider all the multiple systems that they are constantly engaging in, right? Immigration, the criminal justice system, family courts, juvenile courts, child protective services, public benefits, the civil protection order process. Consider all of these systems and consider the first time that your client comes to you, the first time they're offered an interpreter or able to communicate with somebody in a language that they can effectively communicate. Consider what happens if that first time is in your office. What does that say about all the things that we're requesting of our clients? Medical records, court records, child protective services, right? Everything that we rely on for information. What happens when they haven't been provided access? what we think is true because the record tells us it's true may not be true. So what I encourage you to do, in not just thinking about the work that you're doing, and in that immediate moment when we're talking with our client who has limited English proficiency, consider all the multiple systems that they've encountered, all the systems that we ask for records, that we ask information for, and consider asking, hey, did you speak to somebody when you were talking at the hospital? Did you speak to somebody in the language that you understood? Was there a bilingual person there that you talked to? Was there an interpreter there? Oh, did they provide you information on your medication? Was that translated? Did you understand what you were signing when you signed this? Right? Because when we're talking about being trauma informed and we're talking about working with survivors, we know that these language access barriers exist in multiple systems, right? And so what we need to be doing is not just thinking about what we're doing in the immediate, but identifying the barriers that they're encountering, identifying places where information has been written down and has become fact that may actually not be fact. And then figuring out, well, how can we help correct the record if that's part of what needs to be done? So the foundation of all the work that we're doing in terms of federal requirements is Title VI. So that says no person in the United States shall on the grounds of race, color, or national origin be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So there's some case law there. If you ever want to hang out with me and we can open up a bottle of wine, we can talk about Lau v. Nichols and the subsequent case law that's been created that says that language access is a requirement under federal law. And what that basically means, what Title VI means, and what Lau v. Nichols, which is an education case in San Francisco, where Chinese American students who were limited English proficient weren't being provided education. And so there was a lawsuit. And so the Supreme Court found that Title VI includes language access. So if you are receiving federal funds, then all your programs, activities, and benefits must be language accessible. In addition, if you are using federal funds to fund grantees, your grantees must provide meaningful language access to their programs, activities, and benefits, right? So if you're receiving federal funds, and it's not just related to grant funding, right, or money. It's also services. And so one of the challenges that we frequently encounter is with law enforcement, where we're working with advocacy agencies because their law enforcement agencies aren't complying with Title VI. A lot of law enforcement receive equipment from the federal government. That would be considered federal assistance, right? And so that would make the law enforcement agency subject to Title VI and the civil rights requirements. Meaningful access. Meaningful access means language assistance that results in accurate, timely, and effective communication at no cost to the LEP individual. For LEP individuals, meaningful access denotes access that is not significantly restricted, delayed, or inferior as compared to programs or activities provided to English proficient individuals. So when we're talking about limited English proficiency, our understanding of what it means to be limited English proficient has evolved, right? So back when I started working, what we, or at least what I understood limited English proficiency to mean was my grandmother. The extent of her English was to be able to say no English, right? What we know now is the ability to effectively communicate in English for individuals who speak English as a second, third, or fourth language, it's impacted by the situation, stress, and the subject matter, right? Trauma has an impact on how people can effectively communicate in English. One of my colleagues who is an attorney and is actually a language access subject matter expert that works for a state government agency, he shared this story with me. So he had been working with the various state agencies, including law enforcement, as their language access subject matter expert. He was in a fender bender, right? So he was rear-ended in his car. An officer that he had worked with arrived at the scene and said, "Hey, how's it going?" And my colleague was like, "I need an interpreter. I need an interpreter," right? Because his first language isn't English. And the officer was like, "What do you mean you need an interpreter? I know you speak English." And no, he said, "No, I can't think in English right now." okay? Because English isn't his first language, right? And so he had to explain, I can't think, right? I need an interpreter, I can't think. So you can imagine that just being in a small car accident, right, where nobody was really hurt, the trauma of that and the impact on him, he's not only is he an attorney, but a language access expert, right? He couldn't think in English because English was his second language, right? So consider a victim or survivor who's limited English proficient, or in turn, somebody who speaks English, right, as a second or third language. Like a lot of times, you know, we ask the question, well, what language do you most effectively communicate in, right? Effectively communicate. So if you speak English, English is your second language, right? Another way to ask the question is, what language do you dream in, right? Or like, I've got kids, right? There are toys lying on the ground all over the place. No matter how many times I pick stuff up, there's always stuff on the ground. So if I step on a Lego and I shout an expletive, what language am I cursing in, right? So when we think about individuals who have experienced trauma, it's very possible that they won't be able to communicate with you in English, even if they speak English, right? So to consider that as a possibility. A lot of times when we encounter students at college campuses, right? So they're here as international graduate students or undergrads, right? First of all, the language equivalency exam that they have to take doesn't actually demonstrate their fluency and ability to communicate in English effectively, right? It is not a good indicator of English fluency, in my opinion. But another thing is that contextually speaking, their English is going to be subject specific in terms of their fluency. If they're a computer science major, they're going to understand computer science. Will they understand our criminal justice system? Right. So we have to consider the context and trauma that they've experienced. So really quick, I just kind of want to go over some California laws. So California Government Code 68092.1. This is related to the language access requirements at the courts. And what California code requires is that interpreters are provided in both criminal and civil proceedings. So when I first started practicing law, that wasn't the case. The law has been updated. So your clients, if you're working with them and they're in court, they should be provided an interpreter in their civil cases also. Evidence code 756A, that's just what stating that the Judicial Council will reimburse courts for the cost in civil actions. Once again, back in early 2000, the California law still required that individual civil court users pay for the civil court interpreter. So they updated the case law or the government code related to that. The Daimali Alator Bilingual Services Act that requires state and local agencies to ensure that they provide information and services for constituents with limited English proficiency. So anything outside of the courts, the Daimali Alator Bilingual Services Act should apply. So your hospitals and other government agencies, local government agencies. So qualified interpreter. So a qualified interpreter is an interpreter that meets the requirement standards recommended by the Department of Justice. And so the Department of Justice has put out a lot of guidance on what it means to be an interpreter. And also in terms of what you define as a qualified interpreter, right? And so in California, we have certifications. So there's certified court, there's certified medical, administrative hearing certified, and there's one education, right? So there are multiple types of certifications that are available. I will tell you, none of those certifications assess for appropriateness to interpret for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. When you're working with interpreters, certified court is considered the highest standard. It is the most difficult certification to obtain. That doesn't mean that they're appropriate to interpret for survivors. Worst case scenario I've ever heard, and this was well over a decade ago, but in a rape trial, the certified court interpreter told the rape victim who was testifying on the stand, "No wonder you got raped. Look at the way you're dressed." This is a certified court interpreter, right? And the reason why I highlight this is, remember, interpreters are people, right? As a professional, I remember thinking, I just need somebody that speaks the language, right? I'm going to help. I just need somebody that can help me talk to this person, right? We have to remember that interpreters are people, right? They are survivors. They are perpetrators. They have experienced trauma. They experience vicarious trauma. They have biases. So because we are working with survivors, we need to be really cognizant of the fact that we need to pay extra attention, right? We need to find those interpreters that are able to work with and interpret for survivors. So the interpreter's job is to facilitate communication between one, two, or more people who use different languages, being either spoken or signed. And the role also is to place a non-English speaking participant on equal footing with those who understand English to the extent reasonably possible. The interpreter's job is to render everything said in the source language into the target language accurately without omitting, adding, embellishing, or summarizing anything spoken or written. So one of the things we're going to do really quick, if I can find my sheet of paper, because let's see. I'm going to read a couple sentences and then I'm going to ask you all to try to recite back what I've just read. So this is an interpretation exercise. This is called consecutive interpreting. And actually, if none of you, if at least one of you has to be able to do it. If not, I'm not going to stop talking for the rest of the day and you guys can't leave the webinar because Susan said that we have this power. So I'm going to read 3 sentences and I'd like you all to listen. Once I'm done, I'd like you to recite it back just in English. Temporary disability TD benefits. Payments if you lose wages while recovering. For most injuries, TD benefits may not be paid for more than 104 weeks within 5 years from the date of injury. Supplemental job displacement benefit, a non-transferable voucher if you are injured on or after 1/1/2004, your injury causes permanent disability and your employer does not offer you regular, modified, or alternative work. Okay, so 2 sentences. Can anybody recite? Does anybody want to try?
So I'm gonna try.
Okay.
Something about temporary disability benefits are available for about 146 weeks, and there are supplemental benefits when there are injuries, and there are no alternative benefits available through employment.
Close. But you missed a couple things, right?
Oh,
There's
I missed a lot. That was so
5-year,
hard.
right? Yeah, you know, and so what's hard about what's hard about it? Just jump in.
Anyone?
The unfamiliar.
There's so much just to take in and remember that this doesn't go with this and this goes with this and you've got to have this.
And Erica had her hands up.
You are trying to kind of think about and process what's being told to you. At the same time, you're trying to remember it and think about how you're going to repeat it. So there's just a lot going on in your own brain.
Yeah. In the chat, unfamiliar language, too many clauses. Yeah, too many concepts. My goodness.
Yeah. And so what I will say is that a trained professional interpreter would be able to interpret that, right? But that's their job, right? And what I want to highlight is it's not just language ability and fluency in a language that's required for interpreting, right? There are a lot of skills that are tied to being able to interpret effectively. And one of them also is somebody that there's a natural ability. Some people, it just clicks and they're really good at it, right? But it also requires practice. The reason why I like this exercise so much is because a lot of times, you know, the question comes up, well, how do I know what my interpreter is doing, right? So what I encourage you to do is find 2 or 3 sentences that's subject specific to how you're going to be assisting your client, right? So if you're helping them with a protection order of protection or a restraining order, pulling a couple sentences from the instructions and then reading that to your interpreter. If they can't do it from English to English, you can be pretty much guaranteed they cannot do it from English into another language. Does that mean that you can't use that interpreter? No. If that's the only person you have, there's a framework. It provides you a framework in which how you can identify how to effectively work with your interpreter, right? So if I had slowed down, right? So if I had said temporary disability benefits, right? And then I actually take out TD, right? Because that's an acronym. That doesn't mean anything, right? So temporary disability benefits, pause. Interpreter interprets. Payments if you lose wages, pause. While recovering, right? So you can figure out a way to work with your interpreter, especially because we work with our communities and our diversity and our language needs are so great that it can be very challenging to find an interpreter, right? So this is a framework. This gives you a tool that you can use that also assesses for content, right? Specific content, and then also the ability to work with your interpreter based on their skill level, right? So if you need to slow it down, you'll figure out, well, this is how much I need to slow it down so that I can work with this interpreter. So trauma and interpreting. So the linguistic communities, including deaf, excuse me. So when we're talking about limited English proficient, we do include our deaf sign language communities. It's a small communities and interpreters know the lives of many members, right? And so when we think about interpreters in our communities, they're frequently professionals in their home countries. They're doctors, lawyers, teachers, right? They come here, their licenses don't transfer, but they are fluent in English. And so very naturally, what they do is they start interpreting, right? Because they're helping their community. If we consider our clients, they may be experiencing something that they don't want the interpreter to know, right? Because the interpreter is the community. There's still a lot of shame that's associated with being victimized, with being a survivor, right? And it's just like all people, right? We don't want our neighbors to know our business, right? So just being aware of that. And once again, just highlighting in my own practice way back when, I didn't think about these things because I was so desperate to help the person. Like, this person here needs my help, right? So I just need to find somebody that speaks the language. And it didn't really occur to me to consider from the perspective of my client what their needs are. I was considering my need. I need an interpreter. I wasn't considering what my client's needs were. So once again, focusing and centering how we provide language access centered around the needs of our client. Not all interpreters are trained or thoroughly knowledgeable about domestic violence, sexual assault, and trauma-informed practices, right? So once again, going back to interpreters are people, they have biases. They may not be comfortable with the content of the work that we're doing, right? I recently did a training for court interpreters in the state, and several of the court interpreters, they said they're not comfortable with slang, right? And an example that's used by one of the officers I co-facilitate trainings was, and this was a case, the suspect who sexually assaulted a woman told the police in the interview, "Yeah, I fucked her." And the interpreter interpreted it, "Yeah, we had sex." Does that change the meaning? So when we're talking about cases involving trauma, involving sexual assault, checking in with your interpreter and saying, "Hey, are you able to interpret this? How would you interpret fucked?" If they say, and most interpreters are honest, they will say, "You know what, we don't say these things," or "I can't say that." Right? Once they identify their comfort level, if they're not comfortable interpreting within the context of what you're going to be meeting your client about, you need to identify that. And if they can't do it, you need to find another interpreter. And so it's just asking that basic question. I'm aware of an interpreter that's working in the courts that will not say body parts. The interpreter cannot say penis or vagina. The interpreter will interpret the downstairs area. right? So what does that do, right? It's shame. You're shaming the client. The interpreter is bringing shame to the client, right? You're not conveying the information, or the interpreter is not conveying the message or the meaning that is intended. You're going to need more time. So when you're scheduling, make sure you set aside enough time. Remembering that interpreters have the privilege and power of both either being hearing or speaking English, right? So they have positions of authority. Many of our clients may defer to them because not only do they have authority within the community, they may also have authority at the church or the temple, right? And so these people have influence, and they can influence the comfort level of our clients to be able to disclose the information that we need from them or that they want to share. Additionally, our clients may express a gender preference or age preference, right? So if somebody has been assaulted by a male, they may not be comfortable having a male interpreter. Or in turn, we know that, and this has been reported to us by several direct service agencies, where older victims and survivors are uncomfortable working with younger interpreters, right? So, just checking in. And once again, when we're talking about being trauma-informed, focusing less on what we need as service providers, but focusing on what the need is for the LEP client. So working with interpreters. So speak in short, simple sentences. Avoid jargon and slang. Right? But the other thing is that you want to make sure that your interpreter is aware of and knowledgeable of slang, right? How my teenager talks is totally different from how I talk, right? So language is constantly evolving. It goes in terms of generationally, by region. We like to say Spanish isn't just Spanish, right? An example I share, and this is another great exercise. If you're familiar with slang from the community that you're serving, also ask your interpreter, hey, do you know what this means, right? So an example I provide is, well, I use fruit as an example. So when I say pineapple, what is pineapple? When I say pineapple, what are you all thinking? Is it generally fruit? Does anybody have a different definition for pineapple? I just ask because if there is one, I'd love to know. So papaya. Still fruit? Anybody know what papaya is slang for in some Spanish-speaking countries? So papaya in some Spanish-speaking countries is slang for pussy.
Yes. In my country, in Peru, that's what it is.
Peru? Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I could never identify. I keep forgetting which country it is, right? So Peru, right? So it changes the context of the conversation, right? If I'm walking around a playground and I'm saying papaya and you think I'm saying fruit, right? That's one thing. But if you know that papaya is slang for pussy, does that change your analysis of the situation? Right? So we want our interpreters to be aware of the slang that's used. And so asking the question, if you know that this is the slang and language that's used in the community, making sure your interpreter is aware of it, right? Because when we talk about it, how important are the details? How much can we miss? If our interpreters don't understand the slang that's used in the community, right? And it's used by our clients within that context, right? That has a huge impact on the information that we're receiving. So all of this is stuff that, once again, it's if you've got time to ask these questions, right? If you don't have time, you got to work with what you have, but also just follow up when you have that, minute or two where you can kind of check in with the interpreter and check in with the client. Speak slowly, right? So I talk really fast. Just kind of use a normal pace of talking and include pauses. Talking too fast is dangerous, right? Vital information can be lost, but also the reason why we share that speed is dangerous, right, is also we need to communicate to our clients how to effectively work with the interpreter, right? A lot of times, and this has been an issue of debate um, on whether or not, in terms of particularly working with clients who've experienced trauma and they're telling their story to us, whether or not we should pause or stop them when they're telling us a story, or whether or let them continue to speak so that they can have kind of that cathartic release, right? I always fall on the side of we need to explain to them how to work with the interpreter, and if they're talking too fast, to stop them and have them pause, right? I understand why some advocates are like, no, I don't ever want to pause them or stop them. But for me, it's if my interpreter can't keep up because my client is talking so fast, then I'm going to have to ask my client to retell their story, and then I'm re-traumatizing them, right? So explain to them how the interpreter works. Explain to them, we're gonna ask you to speak slower. I'm going to raise my hand for you to pause to allow the interpreter to interpret. We want to provide them that framework. So it's not just about educating us on how to work with the interpreter or educating the interpreter on how to work with survivors. We have to educate our clients on how to effectively work with the interpreter. So that's telling them, hey, we're going to try to slow it down. And if I need you to pause, I'm going to raise my hand and ask you to pause, right? So that the interpreter can continue to interpret, so that I can hear and understand everything that you're trying to tell me. Ask one question at a time. Most of the time, this is like something that we tell attorneys and judges, right? Because we have questions and then third questions, right? And we keep asking questions and we expect everybody to remember and respond to them all. So asking one question at a time. Check for understanding, right? So check in with your client periodically. So if we're talking about the restraining order, protective order process, rather than asking them, hey, do you understand what a restraining order is? Ask them, can you explain to me what a restraining order is? Right? So it's contextual so that they're repeating back everything that you've explained to them. Have the interpreter cite translate all vital documents. So if you don't have if you don't have the forms translated or the documents translated, what you can have the interpreter do is review the document. And then, so if you have like a client's rights form, right? And it's just detailing their rights to victim compensation, and that's not translated in the language for your client. The interpreter, you want to give them time to review it, and then after reviewing it, they can take that English victim compensation form and read it out loud into the target language. So if I have a victim compensation form in English, my Spanish interpreter will read the English, but it will read it out loud into Spanish. Don't allow side conversations. Remember, you're the one assisting your client. There should never be a side conversation between your client and the interpreter where you don't understand what's happening. There might be a conversation, and this is directed by you, right? Where at the very beginning, the interpreter speaks with your LEP client to confirm language match, right? So it's not just, well, you speak Spanish and my interpreter speaks Spanish, so we're good to go, right? Because once again, it's different enough where they may not be able to understand each other. Another issue that frequently comes up is misidentification of primary language, right? And we're seeing this frequently with indigenous languages that are spoken in Mexico and Central and South America. So very like Mixteco or the Mayan languages that we're starting to encounter or people are starting to recognize. So people assume, oh, you're brown and from south of the border, you must speak Spanish, right? And what we're encountering is that there are many indigenous people coming here who they're not fluent in English and they're also not fluent in Spanish, or the language that they most effectively can communicate in is not English or Spanish, but another language. So your interpreter at your direction, or they may request, right? So remember, you have to always know what's happening. So either you direct them to confirm a language match, or the interpreter will say, tell you, I'm going to take a moment to speak with your client so I can confirm language match, right? Maintain control. Remember, you're the one that's directing this conversation, right? The interpreter shouldn't be at any times taking control of the conversation. Also, by maintaining control, I mean also to maintain eye contact with your client and that the client is looking at you and not the interpreter. By default, our instinct is to look at the person that speaks the language that we speak, right? So we want to make sure that our client is looking at us and they understand that we're the ones assisting them. Overcome misunderstandings. So if the interpreter encounters a misunderstanding between you and your client, the interpreter should step out of role and point out that there's a misunderstanding, right? So once again, the concept of protection order or restraining orders, right? It's a legal concept that doesn't exist in a lot of countries. So if that's a point of confusion, the interpreter will step out of role. A professional interpreter will raise his hands and say, the interpreter needs to step out of role. There appears to be some confusion about what you mean by protection order, right? At that point, it's not the job of the interpreter to explain it. So I wouldn't say, well, can you explain it to them so they understand, right? It's still my job to explain and break down what a restraining or protective order is, right? So the interpreter is never going to have an explanatory role. Don't say anything that you would not like the client to hear. And so we've encountered several instances, and this has been shared with us by interpreters that we work with, where the advocate or attorney has turned to the interpreter and said, well, do you believe what they're saying? Do you think that they're telling the truth, right? And then the interpreter, their role is to interpret everything. So they will interpret that, right? So you don't want to say anything that's going to compromise your relationship with your client. So who should interpret? Really quick, we want to jump in? Oh, who should not interpret? Sorry.
Children.
Children. Why not children?
Because they should be protected from conversations, for one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think they shouldn't have to hear so much of their adult family business.
Yeah.
And then secondly, just generally their competency.
Yeah, there's that. And also, will our clients be willing to disclose everything if we use children, right? Children also have biases, right? They may have motives that are not in alignment with our clients' needs, right? So a story I shall, so my parents are immigrants, and so as frequently what happens, my sister was the first one to learn English, right? Because my parents were working, they sent my sister to school. So she was the family interpreter. So she accompanied us to the bank, to the hospital, to the public library, and to school. And from 2nd to 6th grade, because my sister was the family interpreter at my parent-teacher conference. So from 2nd to 6th grade, I was an exemplary student because I would give her a Slurpee and a Snickers bar before, right? Then I hit 7th grade, inflation hit, and she was asking for too much. And so then things started to come out, right? So, but once again, this is what we're seeing happening, right? Because the child is there, they bring my mom and dad would bring my sister, right? Because they knew that an interpreter wasn't going to be provided and they knew they needed my sister, right? And so once again, it falls on us to say, we have an interpreter for you. It's our obligation to provide an interpreter for you. I can't do my job unless I have an interpreter for you.
Shannon, what's your thought on advocates and friends? Because in the chat, we have a lot of good suggestions. People are saying social workers, medical staff.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on?
So as interpreters, if they've been trained on interpretation and they can avoid any kind of biases, then yes, right? First and foremost, if you're doing your job in language, right, and you're not interpreting, then I think that's okay. On the flip side, if you are stepping into the role of interpreter, right, so your role is strictly to function as a conduit, then I would say, are you a trained interpreter and have you been tested?
Mhm.
And the reason why I ask that is you expose yourself to potential liability if you make a mistake. One of the and I'm using law enforcement as an example because this was just shared with me. A police officer that I work with speaks, I think, at least 4 languages, and Russian is one of them. She interpreted the confession of somebody that had been prosecuted with a crime, right? And so she's bilingual. She hasn't been tested as an interpreter. What happened was the defense attorney called her to the stand, and they essentially tested her on the stand for her interpreting ability, not just interpreting her language fluency, her interpreting ability, and her ability to write in Russian. And so they did that all on the stand, right? And so, and this, and the defense attorney called their certified court interpreter expert to essentially cross-examine and assess her on the stand. So if you're in a position where, as part of your job, you are stepping in and interpreting, I would say be mindful of and be prepared to demonstrate your ability to interpret competently, right? Remember, language fluency is different from interpretation ability. And so that's why we use the consecutive interpretation exercise. If your staff person or your bilingual person can't do it from English to English, it becomes problematic for you as an organization, right? And it exposes you to liability. Tracy, do you have a question?
I just wanted to add, the reason why I said advocate too is because you're stepping out of your role. And if you're gonna not, you can't be an advocate and an interpreter at the same time. So if you're there to be the advocate, then you may get asked to testify, or like if you switch roles, you're going to be asked to testify about something that maybe isn't in the best interest of the client as being their advocate. So that's why I think that's another reason.
Thank you for sharing that. You're exactly right, Tracy, right? You don't want to step out of your advocate role. In addition to that, it can be confusing to your client, right? Because as an advocate, if you step into a situation, you're no longer the advocate for the client. And to highlight Tracy's point, you become the interpreter for the system that your client is engaging with, right? So if you're in court, and this happens, this continues to happen where bilingual advocates are accompanying their clients to court, and the court will say, oh, well, you speak, hey, Susan, you speak Korean, you interpret for us, right? Then Susan is no longer the advocate. Now the court views Susan as an officer of the court who's interpreting, right? So the role has shifted, the obligation has shifted, right? So thank you, Tracy, for sharing that. You don't want your advocates to have switch their hats, right? So in addition to the interpretation skills and abilities. Family members, obviously, once again, biases, friends or neighbors, right? If the client is comfortable with them and they're bringing them, how comfortable are they? Will they be willing to disclose everything that needs to be discussed? But in addition to that is the skill and ability, right? The reason why our clients rely on family members and friends and children is because they're so used to systems turning them away, right? Well, we don't have an interpreter, come back when you bring a friend, right? That's what they're told. So they're being proactive. They're bringing their friend, right? Or in turn, they're told, hey, we will reschedule you when we have an interpreter available, and then they never hear again from that system. COVID really did highlight the issues around language access, where people were trying to get rental assistance and public benefits assistance, and they would call in, and whoever was managing that would say, well, please hold on the line and while we connect you to an interpreter, and they've been on hold for 2 hours, and then they're placed on hold again for another 2-3 hours, and then the call drops, right? So our LEP clients are used to not being provided language access, so they bring family members, they bring friends, and so it falls on us to say, hey, no, we're going to provide a professional interpreter, and we have to do that to make sure that we're able to effectively communicate with you. So really quick around language access planning. So hopefully you and your organizations have a language access plan. The Department of Justice doesn't require that you have a language access plan, but they do like to see that you have one, right? And in particular, and what I've noticed is whenever there's a Title VI complaint that's been filed against a federal grant recipient, what always happens is a language access plan is written as a result of that complaint. So they don't require it. It's a good way to show compliance, but also it's a good practice, because just because it's in my head doesn't mean that it's part of the organization, right? And so I just kind of want to highlight some of the things that the Department of Justice wants you to include, or encourages you to include in a language access plan. So understanding how LAP individuals interact with your agency, how you're going to provide language assistance services. And so we talk about a lot of interpretation, but honestly, my opinion, the best way to provide access is to hire bilingual, multilingual staff that can effectively do their jobs in the languages that have been identified. So, in addition to us saying, hey, make sure that you assess your interpreters, assess your bilingual staff, right? I remember when I was first practicing, my boss at least once a week for about 3 months would come into my office and say, hey, Cannon, you speak Korean. I was like, oh no, right? Because, I when I went into undergrad, I took the Korean fluency exam, and I thought I was going to test advanced, and they sent me to Korean basic, right? So I know my Korean is really rudimentary, right? So just because people self-identify as language fluent, right, because they grew up speaking the language, doesn't mean that they can functionally do their job in the language. So you want some form of testing so that you can demonstrate and they can demonstrate that they can do the job in the languages that are needed. Identify and assessing your LAP communities. So another thing is make sure that you're going beyond the census, right? The census isn't a very good indicator of what languages are in our communities, right? It also doesn't provide the disaggregated information that we need, like Spanish, but Spanish from where and what generation? Has the Spanish speaking community been here since the 1800s, or are they recent immigrants from Peru? We're seeing a lot of Afghan refugees and Ukrainian refugees. The census isn't going to capture that information. It's not going to capture indigenous languages. It defines Chinese as a language. Does that help us? Chinese, what does that mean? Does that mean Mandarin? Does that mean Cantonese, right? Are we doing traditional or simplified for translation? So we need that information. So encourage you to have a system to collect that information, reach out to your partners, hospitals, courts, legal aid agencies, other governmental agencies, and ask, hey, what languages are you seeing? And getting that very specific information. Providing training for your staff, not just on how to use the language access plan, but how to work effectively with interpreters, how to work with and communicate with bilingual staff. One of the trainings that we most frequently request is how to hang up on a bad language line interpreter, right? So really quick is when you encounter a bad interpreter over the telephone, right? How do you hang up on that interpreter without, and also let your client know that you're hanging up on the interpreter, but you're going to get a new interpreter, right? And so it really is just coming down to, rather than saying, hey, Cannon, you're a terrible interpreter, I'm hanging up, I want you to get me a new interpreter, right? Something we don't want to do because we don't know what the interpreter will communicate to our client. So we say, we're talking to our client, we're not addressing the interpreter. Say, you tell the client, Susan, there's a matter that I just became aware of that I have to address immediately. I'm going to hang up on the interpreter once I've addressed the issue. I'm going to get a new interpreter for us to follow up on our conversation, right? You hang up, then you call the telephonic interpretation company. You say, hey, I just want to let you know that interpreter 1234, Cannon Han, is a really bad interpreter. Remove them from our contract and please assign me a new Spanish interpreter immediately, right? Then they'll get you a new interpreter. Providing notice. So how are you notifying the public, right? And it's not just putting an I Speak poster on your wall? Are you doing outreach to the communities you're intending to provide services to? Are you using local radio, newspapers? Are you going to the places that the LEP communities are and letting them know that you're available to provide services? Monitoring, evaluating, and updating, right? So once you have a plan, we want to be updating it, right? We want to check to make sure if it's working, but also we need to update it to identify the languages that are coming in, right? So we know that Afghan and Ukrainian refugees are going to be coming into our communities, right? As soon as we hear that refugee relocation is looking at placing communities, we should be looking at our plan and saying, how are we going to find these resources? Where are we going to be translating some of our information and our services into Dari, Pashto, and Ukrainian, right? If we know they're coming, we need to be doing that, right? So really quick, and these examples are based on cities that we've actually done trainings with. So Agency A is on a citywide contract to use LanguageLine to speak with limited English individuals. Only managers are given the number and access code to LanguageLine. Occasionally, LanguageLine will come to give trainings on how to work with telephonic interpreters. Is this agency in compliance with Title VI?
Swastika said no.
Yeah.
Christina said no.
I'm guessing everyone has to have the information, not just some people.
Yeah, that's correct. And we worked with an agency, and this was the issue because once again, managers are busy people. They're not just sitting around waiting for their team to ask them for access to LanguageLine, right? So when you have, and I understand why this was the case, right? Because the city in this particular instance, because LanguageLine cost so much, they were trying to do cost controls, right? They didn't want their staff. But once again, what happened was staff was turning people away. They were turning people away because they weren't able to access LanguageLine. So if whatever resources you have to provide language access, you have to make sure that they're available. Another thing that we frequently see is that organizations will say, our first line response to providing interpretation services or language services is bilingual staff, right? But what happens is they list the bilingual staff, but the bilingual staff aren't available, right? And so there's nothing that follows up that would allow for them to provide meaningful language access. So whatever the case is, whatever you include in your plan, you have to make sure that it's accessible. Remember, there can't be a significant delay. It needs to be as close as possible, the equivalent of services for an English-speaking person coming to access services. So we shouldn't be saying, can you come back tomorrow? Or can you come back in a couple hours, right? We need to have something in place where we can interact with the client as soon as possible. Translation. So programs should provide translation of vital written materials into the language of each frequently encountered LEP group eligible to be served and are likely to be affected by the recipient's program. When we're talking about translations, another thing that we want to build into the process is a process called back translation. So if you work with professional translation companies, they should have this process in place. So another tip is when you are looking for translations, right? Or a company to do translations, can ask them, do you back translate? If they don't know what you're talking about, I'm not saying you can't work with them. You want to build that process in. So back translation is a process where the translator takes an English document and translates it into another language, right? And then a different translator who wasn't involved in the original translation will take that translation. So once again, let's say it's Spanish. So it's been translated by one translator and from English into Spanish. Then a different translator comes in, takes the Spanish and translates it back into English. And then you see if there are any issues with the translation. That's an industry standard, right? For professional translation companies, you want to ask if that's in place. Another thing is community review of translations. And so we actually encountered this a couple times with some organizations that we support. So when COVID hit, right, people were trying to translate all this information and get information out into the community, both in terms of COVID awareness, but also how to access services during COVID. And so a couple of the organizations, they went with translation companies, larger translation companies. And when they got the translations back and they distributed it to the community, what they heard back from the community was, this doesn't make sense to us. It has no meaning, right? So Spanish, as an example, Spanish was one of the languages where there were issues, and it was because the translation company, they had translators who translated from English to Spanish from Spain at a very professional level, right? Spanish from Spain was not what was spoken in the community, right? So you want to make sure that any translations you do, you validate with your community. So if you have staff that are from the community, if you work with other community-based organizations, just check in with them and ask, hey, can you review our translations just to confirm that we're doing okay? Like, and then you get A+ bonus points if you build that process into your budgets, right? And then you compensate your community-based organizations for helping you review translated materials so that you're making sure that it's relevant, because you don't want to invest tens of thousands of dollars into translations and then find out you can't use them because it doesn't match your community. In talking about vital documents, so documents related to services provided, including but not limited to notice of rights, intake and application forms, consent and complaint forms, notices of denials, losses, or decreases of benefits. So anything impacting their rights, you want to make sure that you're translating, because those are considered vital documents, right? If outreach materials are how you're reaching your clients and your communities, you need to be translating your outreach materials. If you've got just let's say you have information on a historic, you're housed in a historic building, right? And then you've got information in English, a brochure on when the building was built, who it was built by, and all that stuff, right? That's not considered vital documents. So you're looking at the services that you're providing. So how your clients are accessing their services, how they're understanding their rights, and how you're communicating to your client about their rights and anything that impacts them. So scenario 2, agency B has numerous signs in their entryway about free interpretation. Their front staff is trained on how to identify languages of LEP individuals and how to contact a telephonic or in-person interpreter. The agency has a language access plan that is annually updated and has clear protocols on how to contact an interpreter when training is available and a contact person for language access issues. Are they in compliance with Title VI? So the quick answer is yes, and I think people are
Yes,
responding.
that's what I was going to
yes.
say.
Yeah, awesome. Right, and so this is what we want to see, right, from top to bottom. And this agency was following the Department of Justice guidelines, right? So that little chart that I shared with you. So really quick, what languages are you seeing in your community? And if we put that in the chat, or if you want to jump in.
Parsi, Mixteca, Punjabi, wow, lots of different languages. Nepali, Hindi, Pashto, Dari, Urdu, Pashto, yeah.
Yeah, so and that's the thing, like, I mean, the last time I checked, there's over 120 languages and dialects spoken in California, right? And so the challenge for us really is how can we provide services in all those languages, right? It is very difficult. And I know that you all are doing the best that you can and that you're all doing amazing work. But I want to kind of talk about technology and how we lean into technology, particularly when we're encountering languages where we don't
I
have
try to
the
stop at
resources
the
set up.
Caribbean store on my way home.
Sweetie, I'm
and get two
sorry,
things of shea butter.
can you mute
then-
yourself? Thank you.
So so we have video remote interpreting. So and we've leaned in a lot into video remote interpreting, particularly with COVID, and that's actually expanded resources for us, right? So video remote interpretation is connecting with our interpreters via Zoom, right? Whether that's sign language, whether it's a language we have difficulty finding professional interpreters in. Same with telephonic interpretation, right? And what that's shown is it's actually expanded the reach that we have for accessing interpreters. One of the resources that was shared with me recently was connecting with embassies to identify interpreters for indigenous languages, right? So leaning into technology to expand the pool of interpreters that we have access to has been very helpful. Video relay service, that is the technology that's replaced TTY. So when we're calling and communicating with somebody that's deaf that uses American Sign Language, we'll be using video relay service. You cannot use video relay service as an interpretation service when you're meeting with somebody who is deaf in person, right? That's actually a violation of, I think, the FCC, the federal law. So that's just for telephonic purposes, communicating with somebody who's deaf, right? One of the things I want to highlight is just because they are deaf, it doesn't mean that they use American Sign Language, right? There's something called home signing. So individuals who don't learn the formal sign language will have something called home signing that's developed to communicate with the people in their home. And there are other sign languages, right? There's a Mexican Sign Language, Spanish Sign Language, Japanese Sign Language, Korean Sign Language, French Sign Language, lots of different sign languages, Black Sign Language, right? So, making sure if you're serving the deaf community to also identify what sign language they can most effectively communicate in. Communication access real-time translation. So that's captioning technology. And frequently where you'll see that is somebody who becomes hard of hearing or deaf later in life, and so is fluent in English and can read English or another language. And what you do is you provide a captioning service. So somebody's typing and they read on the screen. Instant or text messaging is also a technology that we've seen advocates start to use to help communicate with clients, particularly when they're having difficulty connecting with an interpreter. And real-time machine translation. So in terms of real-time machine translation, I'm also including real-time machine interpretation. So that's your Google Translate, right? Or your Google Talk, or whatever the technology is. And so one of the stories I like to share is when I worked for a transit agency, we were trying to translate. We had parking machines that were being installed, and they say, "Hey, Canon, we need to translate this into 4 languages." And I said, "Great, how much time do I have and how much money do I have?" And they said, "We're installing it this week and we don't have any money." So all the information that was on the parking machine that, they included the civil code and, everything, all that, and it was a couple sentences, we distilled that into exact change only. And so what is exact change only? That means if parking costs $10 and I put a $20 bill in, I'm not getting any change, right? And if we don't communicate that, we're going to have really upset people standing in front of the parking machine because they're not getting change, right? So we put that into Google Translate, and the Spanish came out fine because we had staff and friends review the Spanish. The Vietnamese came out fine. And then it was traditional and simplified. And I believe in the traditional, instead of exact change only, what came back was exact transformation only, right? So totally different message, very confusing. Another example that was recently shared with me, an advocate was working with one of his clients, and he was trying to schedule an appointment. So he said, our meeting is scheduled for June 15th at 3 p.m. That's what he put into Google Translate. What his client received was, our date is June 15th at 3 p.m. Right? He wasn't asking his client out on a date. It was a meeting, right? So what are the limitations of technology, right? Whether it's a translation, or have we all seen kind of the technology where you talk into your phone and then it speaks for you? Like, so the example I said, like, I'm in Italy, I want to find gelato. I open up my phone app and I say, where can I find the best gelato? And my phone spits it out in Italian. And the person I asking responds in Italian into my phone, and then it the phone interprets back into English for me, right? The limitation of these technologies, it doesn't understand context, right? And remember, context is so important, particularly when we're working with victims and survivors. So be careful. Will I say don't use it? Absolutely not. No, there are going to be instances where you're going to rely on it because you have no other resource, but understand the limitations of the technology. Make sure you're just taking down basic information. Like if it can't understand the distinction between a meeting and a date, that's problematic, right? So basic information only. And then once you're able to find an interpreter, confirm the information that you're trying to communicate with your client. The other thing about these technologies is that these are learning softwares. The reason why they're free is because they're collecting information on you, right? It understands, and the software learns context because of the information that you're inputting. What that means is that anything you input, whether it's you type it or whether you speak it, it's saved on a server. So do you want the information that you're communicating to be saved on a server that can be accessed by a software engineer? It's not a question of just do you want, could you be violating state and federal law because you're including privileged or confidential client information, right? So just be very careful around the use of these technologies. So don't use names, nothing that can identify your client because it can be accessed. It's saved on a server somewhere and it can be accessed. One of the things I like to share is the iSpeak cards. And this was created years ago by Saheli for Asian families. I forget what their name is now, but they're based in Austin, Texas. And what this provides is they created a card for their clients. So it's something that the clients can use, not just in terms of within your organizations if you have multiple services, but it's also a way for them to self-advocate. And so it lays out what the obligations are under Title VI. It identifies the language that your client needs interpretation into. Also, the reason why I like this example is it provided the contact information for an advocate if there were any issues, right? So even if they're having issues with the particular agency they're trying to get assistance from and an interpreter from, your client can turn it around and point to who they should call. So they would know, oh, okay, if there's a problem, if I show them my iSpeak card and they still won't provide interpretation services, or there's confusion because they keep telling me to bring my advocate, to interpret, they can turn the card and then the person that they're interacting with knows to call me, Canon, so that I can explain, no, under Title VI, you're supposed to be providing an interpreter. Really quick, some resources. So the Interagency Language Roundtable, so the federal agencies got together and they established standards on language fluency and interpretation ability. So it's on a scale of 1 to 5, right? And the reason why I like the Interagency Language Roundtable is they also have a self-assessment on language fluency, right? So it breaks it down into speaking, listening, and reading. And the reason why I like it is if we don't have a test for a person that we're bringing, a bilingual person on staff that we're intending to hire, if we don't have a way to test them, it's a way for them to do a self-assessment, right? And so it's on a scale from 1 to 5, and it goes from I can follow basic directions, I can ask for and follow basic directions, to which is level 1 basic, to level 5, I can do a presentation on the impact of radiation on mitochondrial DNA after Chernobyl to the United Nations, right? So that's a 5+, right? And it gives a framework for us to talk to our bilingual, multilingual staff about how comfortable they are or what they feel their level of fluency is in a language, right? So it's not just asking, hey, Canon, do you speak Korean, or are you fluent in Korean? It makes me, because then I might think, yeah, I can do it. Yeah, because I grew up speaking it. But it really makes me sit there and think, because I have to go through this checklist and think about, oh, wait, no, I wouldn't be comfortable talking about radiation and mitochondrial DNA, right? No, I'm going back to, I'm more of a 3 or a 2 or a 3, right, than a 5, right? So it makes people who you're relying on that are bilingual to really think about their level of language fluency. And if you're working with interpreters, they don't have a checklist, but they've established standards for interpretation ability that you can go over with your interpreters, and they can point to, yeah, well, I feel like I'm a level 4+ interpreter, right? Or they'll say, you know what, I'm more of a level 1, right? So it provides a framework for you to have a conversation and assess, do a self-assessment with the people that you're working with. LEP.gov is the clearinghouse for all federal agencies on language access. So if there's any information you need from your federal funder related to language access, it will be there. Also, any of the memorandums of agreement that the civil rights agencies, each federal civil rights agency has entered into due to a Title VI violation, you'll find those there. So if you kind of want some information on what agencies look for, what the civil rights agencies look for, enforcement agencies look for during Title VI investigations, that information will be there. It's also a great advocacy tool. So if you're advocating with different agencies on language access, you can point to the memorandums of agreement, or you can print copies of those and share them to say, hey, you want to make sure that you're not in violation like some of these other agencies. The Asian Women's Shelter in San Francisco, the multilingual advocate model, that's one of the models that have been used to provide language access at the direct services level. Community Legal Interpreter Bank, IUDA is a Washington, D.C. based legal services agency. They actually they identified that more legal interpreters were needed. And so they trained a pool of interpreters to become legal interpreters, so building capacity internally. National Center for State Courts did a survey on serving limited English proficient battered women. I'm not sure if they've still got that posted. If you're interested in that, I do have a copy of that. I'm happy to share that with you. Another resource that was shared with me, and this was, we were looking for translated resources because once again, there are so many languages spoken in California, and we were kind of at a loss. And one of our colleagues that I was doing a training for shared with me Hot Peach Pages, and this was a in-person training, and they said, oh yeah, go to Hot Peach Pages. What does Hot Peach Pages sound like? Does that sound like something that I should be looking up on my work computer, right? I was like, I'm not going to do that, right? But it's an incredible resource, right? And so this is a clearinghouse, an international clearinghouse that has links to sexual assault and domestic violence agencies across the world. And they've created translated materials in multiple languages. I haven't been able to validate any of them, right? But these have all been created by government agencies or direct service agencies. And it's an incredible resource. And you can look in terms of the languages that are provided. So over 110 languages. These are just some of the languages. And the types of information that you can find. And granted, not every language has the exact same resources. We're relying on a lot of the countries of origin providing and developing these resources, or some advocacy agencies, right? But information about domestic violence, sexual assault. And so this is an incredible resource, and I encourage you to tap into it. And if you have the capacity on staff to review some of the information, and if you want to let me know, hey, this is some good stuff, I'd love to hear back from all of you. So the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence is a national resource center providing training and technical assistance on the different ways that gender-based violence manifests itself in API communities. And so the larger Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence can support you when we're talking about gender-based violence in API communities. My work under the Interpretation Technical Assistance Resource Center, if you notice, I'm not limited to API languages. We do provide technical assistance and training in all languages. And with that, there's my contact information. I think we have a little time for questions, or if anybody has any comments.
Great, Cannon. Thank you so much, and for your work, and also the API Gender-Based Violence Institute's work as well. I mean, we started this work back in the 90s, a long time ago when we were children. But, you know, the needs are still there, right? And we definitely need to continue to educate ourselves, our providers, our clients, and our systems partners on these issues. Let's see. I don't know, Swastika, I think you have a lot of experience, and it looks like you were active in the chat box. You probably have a question or comment, Swastika. And then Sherry, I'll go to you next.
Thank you for your presentation. I have been trained by Asian Women Center Multilingual Language Advocate model, and this is amazing. I can affirm their model of language access to domestic violence survivor. One thing that I keep on coming back to my client, and I keep on coming back, is speaking English, comprehending it, and then answering it is 3 different things.
Mm.
And I'm working with a Punjabi speaking client who has 2 social workers working with her. And one thing that I'm coming across is she speaks English enough to have conversation, not understand the system and its requirement, mandated things that she is supposed to be following. So what I am struggling is trying to ask her to change social workers report. And oftentimes, one of the things I've seen with my clients struggling is interpretation being misinterpreted and having to deal with misinformation and getting into trouble because of the language. So thank you so much for your presentation again. There are a lot of work that comes with language access line and dealing with interpreters and having to identify obstacles in every single language interpretation. And it's a lot of work.
And thank you so much for the work you're doing. And it feels like there's a training need for the social workers that are serving your client. So if you're interested in you and I working together to offer up and get a training to the social workers so they better understand the limitations and the issues that are coming up for your clients, so that it doesn't become we kind of eliminate some of the knowledge barriers that have been created because the social workers are just assuming, oh, the interpreter's here, it's fine. Or, oh, hey, the client speaks enough information, English, that they get it, right? We need to get them to a place where they really do understand and they're focusing less on their need, but on the need of the LEP, your LEP client that they're working with. So I do a lot of work with training systems. So if that's something that you'd like some assistance in engaging with, just reach out to me and we can kind of figure out what to do. And I love Asian Women's Shelter. I mean, everybody there's so incredible.
Sherry, do you want to go next?
Yes, hi. Cherie Dancy, licensed clinical social worker, case manager, Contra Costa Health Plan. First, I'd like to say this was a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. It was very informative and digestible. My 2 comments are, the first comment is, this is a presentation that I'm in healthcare, and I really feel like the people in healthcare really need to see this, because as a former medical social worker in the county hospital and now as a case manager with the health plan for Contra Costa, I have come across a lot of staff who try to speak broken English to people or speak loudly to people who do not speak the language in an effort to get their message across or get their task done. And I feel like there may need to be some advocacy for more interpreters in the healthcare facilities and clinics, so that when a doctor, nurse, social worker, whomever needs to do some translation with some of the main languages, at least some of those threshold languages, that there's someone there that they can just pull and say, hey, I need your help, come translate, if they are not, getting not getting an interpreter on the line. So I am advocating on my end, but I would encourage others to advocate for interpreters inside the healthcare facilities. My second comment is that at Contra Costa Health Plan, we do provide interpreters and translation services for our contracted providers and for our members. As a case manager, I have experienced clients coming to me saying their appointments were canceled or they were told to go elsewhere because they do not have a staff person that speaks their language. So as the case manager, I did have to intervene with that clinic and say, why are you not using our free interpreter services and translation services? And why are you denying this patient services at your clinic? Although our provider relations department, we do send out announcements. It is in the provider manual. There needs to be continual training for staff that comes into those clinics and healthcare facilities that is the law. And when they are blocking a patient from giving them the adequate information in their own language, that's breaking the law. And then they want to accuse the patient of non-compliance, which that's not a term I like to use, but they're not adhering to the medical regime because they don't fully understand what is being asked of them. So again, thank you for this presentation. Greatly needed. I hope you all do it again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm so glad that we were able to bring Canon to our community. We'll certainly stay in touch, and you will all have his contact information so that you could follow up with additional requests for training. I know there's a lot more in his shelves, I want to say, not arsenal. I don't want to use the weapons metaphor. So Canon, maybe we could close it with your final comment.
Thank you once again. I'm here as a resource to all of you. So if you want to bring this training to your staff and your team, or you feel like you want to engage in systems like hospitals and provide training to hospitals around meaningful language access and being trauma forward and compliance, just reach out to me. I'm happy to assist you. Anything I have, please, feel free to use. And I do love training the trainers. So if you want to bring this knowledge and capacity to your organizations, so you can reach out to that you can do the trainings yourself, just let me know. Thank you all for spending part of your day with me, and I look forward to working with all of you. Bye.